Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanity for today's Lunch and Learn program. In 75 years, how will we and others remember the COVID-19 pandemic? While there are plenty of news stories, there will be new generations who will want to hear and learn from the personal stories of homemade face masks, social distancing, massive unemployment, school closures, and the overnight ghost town that was once bustling, traffic-clogged Seattle. We will have stories for our children, grandchildren, and future generations who were born after this pandemic. We will have personal stories that will shape our families for generations to come. In 2003, I met Vera Federman for the first time. She was lively and sharp-witted and had a personality that was so much larger than her petite frame. And she had so many stories. She was a survivor of the Holocaust, a Hungarian woman who survived Auschwitz. Vera was a member of the Holocaust Center for Humanity's Speakers Bureau for many years. She shared her experiences with students and adults and personified resilience and determination. Her stories gave us the true human experience behind this massive history of the Holocaust. Vera passed away in 2017, but her granddaughter Breeze, who had heard these stories from her grandmother since she was young, recognized their power and importance. She was the legacy of this history. Breeze worked with our skilled and meticulous team at the Holocaust Center to research the history behind Vera's stories and to weave them together so that they could continue to be shared with generations to come. In addition to being a new member of the Holocaust Center Speakers Bureau, Breeze works at a nonprofit healthcare organization and is the mom of 2 girls. We are so pleased to have Breeze sharing her grandmother's stories with us today from her own home. Before I turn it over to Breeze, I'd like to please encourage anyone participating today to please take a moment to support our work at the Holocaust Center for Humanity. Your gifts help us to support engaging programs like this one, provide educational resources and opportunities for students, even when they are out of school, and personal support for Holocaust survivors. You can make a gift on the Holocaust Center's website. We are grateful for your support. Thank you. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to type in your questions, and Breeze will address them at the end of the presentation. So with that, Breeze, I turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Alana, and thank you for that introduction. And I really just want to welcome everybody and thank you so much for joining us today. I know that we are all living in a little bit more of a virtual world, and so hopefully we'll be able to reach this story, my grandmother's story, we'll be able to reach more people than even when we meet in schools and teach this curriculum elsewhere. So I think connection now more than ever maybe is absolutely vital. So and it's definitely important to help keep stories like my grandmother's legacy alive. So I grew up here in Washington, and yes, I'm the mother of 2 girls. I still live here in the Seattle area. I work from my home and now in nonprofit healthcare. I'm also a writer. I'm working on a few stories, so that's an exciting part of my life now. And just, there we go. And so I get to share my grandmother's story with you today. So this is a picture of us on her worn leather couch. This is her reading to me when I was a child. So this is one of my very fond memories of her. And so basically, just to start, I just want to say that I want to kind of keep going back to the why and the why I am doing this and the why I feel this is so important. My grandmother felt that it was so important for her to share her story of survival and all the different ways that she survived this horrible experience. I am a cancer survivor myself, and I choose to tell my story whenever called upon, whenever asked to do so. And I feel that that's a way of honoring other people that have been affected by cancer in the way that my family and I have. And to honor those friends that I've lost. So that's something that my grandmother and I really shared together. And when I was able to work with the Holocaust Center to put this together, it was an absolute honor for me And I've learned so much about her story. I learned bits and pieces when I was a kid, because all these little stories coming in from different areas, I didn't really understand the chronological timeline that was happening until working with the Holocaust Center. So I'm so thankful to them for helping to gather resources, and we continue to gather resources. I found more last night and last week, and so it's continuously growing, and I'm so honored to be able to share that with her. We have so much video testimony, because my grandmother was an absolute advocate. She spoke whenever called upon. And so I'm actually very lucky, fortunate that we're able to hear directly from her words. I have a little bit of her written testimony that I get to read from, and then as well as some video. So we get to hear directly, hear her voice. So if we could click to the next slide. So when we teach this in schools, it's important to, especially to go over these vocabulary words that will come up throughout my presentation and throughout other Holocaust curriculum. So anti-Semitism is the prejudice against Jewish people, the ghetto, and that's somewhere where my grandmother was and her family were taken after being taken from their homes and before going to Auschwitz. The slave labor camps, so there were several different ones, and those were where the Jews and other prisoners were forced to work for the war effort. Displaced persons camp, so this is where after the war and liberation, many people didn't have their homes. They were taken from them, so they needed somewhere to stay. So my grandmother stayed in one of those as well. So, and now I will let my grandmother introduce herself.
My name is Vera Federman, and I was born in Debrecen, Hungary, where I grew up and went to school, and went to Jewish elementary school. And then from there, my dad decided I should go to a gymnasium. There was no Jewish girls' gymnasium, so I went to a Protestant gymnasium, from which I graduated.
She was always so proud of her education, and so she spoke about that often. And then this is her town in Debrecen. I think if we click one more time, we'll see it. There we go. And so she described this as a place, a small town outside of Budapest there, and the population was 120,000, 10% of which were Jews. And then if we move on to the next, we're going to learn about her family history. So this is a photo of her parents, which was actually saved after the war. She was able to retrieve it at her house. Some of the photos and things were saved. She would talk about spending time in summers in the vineyards with her grandparents. She'd speak highly about that. Her father was a prisoner in Siberia, prisoner of war in World War I. And so as we go through this presentation, we're going to talk about what's going on in her family and her childhood during the time of the war. So we're going to, the next slide, we'll talk about the economic crisis that was going on in Germany during this time. And so this economic crisis is one of the reasons why there was such a rise in anti-Semitism, because the Jews were blamed for the severe poverty and situation that was going on. So the sign there that's the arrow is pointing to is a sign that says "Vote Hitler." So this is a long unemployment line in Germany, and Hitler was looked at as a way to solve the situation. So he was voted into power soon after. So the next slide is of my grandmother's childhood. So this is a photo of her and her cousin Marika, who also survived the war, and I grew up knowing her as well. And so our families would have adventures at the lake together and things like that. So my grandma was an only child. She loved the theater and the ballet, and all sorts of things, poetry and music and dancing. And she definitely loved to take us to the theater or the Secret Garden. And Frank, anytime there was a play, we would all get dressed up and go together. So fond memories of that time with her. Her childhood home, this is a picture of one she spoke about often near the synagogue. And I hope it's still there, and I hope someday to visit there as well. Her and my grandfather also loved to travel. And so I really wish I would have kept all the postcards of their travels. Her education was incredibly important to her. Her father insisted that she get the best education possible at the time. So Jews were not allowed a higher education, so she got the highest education she could, which was the high school equivalent of a high school graduation, but that she wasn't able to go to university. Jewish girls weren't allowed to attend, but Jewish boys at the time weren't either, because they were forced into forced labor camp. And then a lot of families thought Jews weren't allowed to have any jobs afterwards either. So there were many that stopped education because there wasn't a reason to, and they just needed to work first. She loved to read. This is one of my favorite pictures of her reading. She spoke many languages. I feel like we get a different count every time we count, but German, French, Hungarian, all of which saved her life. English, obviously, she learned when she was 14 is when she started learning English, and she loved to study, loved to read. This photo here is a photo that she actually shared with us, probably as many visits as I remember. She would pull this video or this photo out and show us of her favorite teacher. So this is one of her favorite teachers. So this would have been in first or second grade around 1931. And interestingly enough, when we pulled this photo for this presentation and we were putting it together, they asked me which one was my grandmother, and I pointed, and so that arrow is actually pointing to the person my grandmother would point to when she would show me this photo, and it's actually her best friend, Vera Shipush, who we'll talk about as well. They're lifelong friends, and she did survive the Holocaust as well. So my grandmother, Vera Frank, is one to the left. She's the one with the squinting eyes there. So she spoke highly of this picture in this class. Her cousin Marika is third from the bottom, third in, and so the three of them did survive the war. Being educated definitely saved her life, so it's something that she was always very fond of and encouraged us to have as much education as possible too. It was very important to her. So in the next slide, we'll talk about what's going on economically as well. So in 1933, my grandmother was 9 when Hitler came into power, and he was appointed chancellor at that time. 3 months later, he was granted emergency power by the Enabling Act. So that meant that he was able to declare war. So he had that power automatically because of that act. So the next slide. The next slide. So this is the anti-Semitism that was happening in Hungary. So right where where my grandmother was living, the race laws were passed. And so that timeline of events, I think that's really important to mention, especially when I'm speaking to students, is that it was less than 5 years from 1933 to 1938. That was the build of hate and race separation. And it's so important to highlight that. Personal stories that my grandmother spoke of, especially during some of her interviews that I have been able to watch and research. She recalls stink bombs being thrown into her apartment area. So even though her neighborhood was a Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, they were still being attacked racially like that. She remembers the son of one of the close family friends, the son actually joining the anti-Semitic Hungarian group. And when she was 11 or 12, the funny little story it was so great to hear her tell stories like this, because she was just such she was a small statured woman, but she was definitely fierce. So when she was about 11 or 12, one of the classmates called her and her best friend Vera, she called them dirty Jews. And so the way she tells this story is, she said, so we beat her up. It was something that she just didn't tolerate, even at 11 or 12. So, and then one of the classmates also, she had found out that on their door to their home, they walked past the home of one of her classmates, and it said, no Jews or dogs allowed. So these were the things she was dealing with around this time and around her age. So Jewish men were forced into labor battalions, where 27,000 died. And then this is a photo of the Hungarian Arrow Cross, which, like I said, some boys were even joining at that time. So next, my grandmother will talk.
As I said, at first we didn't expect anything really bad, because we never heard as to what happened to the Jews of Poland or France or the other, or Russia. We didn't. That was big secrecy. But in a very few days, we found out that something is beginning. By April 5th of 44, we had to wear the yellow star. We couldn't go out on the street without affixing it on an outer garment. And not more than 2 weeks later, there was feverish activity to set up a ghetto and put a brick wall around it. And in May of sometimes in May, we were ordered to move in there and leave all of our possessions behind.
So remembering at this time as well that there was no internet or cell phones. Communications were limited and restricted and illegal at that time. So I'm going to read a quote from an article she wrote in 1984, which I'll reference a few more times after this. But so these are her words. We listened nightly to the BBC and awaited impatiently the entry of America into the war. In spite of the long-term prospects, at that moment, all of Europe was still under the bestial rule of Nazi Germany, and we knew not what had happened to the millions of Jews elsewhere. About a month before, we had heard part of Hitler's speech quoted on Hungarian radio to the effect that, "You high and mighty Hungarian Jews, beware." My friends and I discussed this in a strange and terrible threat in partial disbelief. Up to now, we lived in relative safety and in prosperity in our homes. So if we go to the next slide, so this, so as she described, this is an image of the yellow star and a photo of some Hungarian Jews and some of the men being forced into Italian labor camp. And so I'll read one more quote here while we're on this slide. A few more days went by, and with them the illusions that the Germans would leave us alone in the face of their mounting military urgencies. One edict followed another, first to rob us of our bank accounts, valuables, jewelry, and on the 5th of April to mark us with the yellow star. The weather turned warm and balmy, and optimistically we hoped that they would be satisfied with money and jewelry at least for a while. Actually, I must say that they did not get any of our jewelry because my mother scorned the idea of complying with this order. She dug an immense hole in the garden, and in it she buried her jewelry and that of her sisters-in-laws, as well as the sterling silver cutlery trays and other porcelains. And they moved into the Debrecen ghetto when the Nazis occupied Hungary in 1944. And then deportations began in April 1944. So if we go on to the next slide, so this is what that journey would have looked like. So on June 27th, they were taken from Debrecen to Auschwitz camp in Poland. There were 86 people per car, cattle car, as she described. One bucket in the corner for everyone to use on that cattle car. She does describe them stopping one time for water, where they each received a thimble of water, and her mother actually used that thimble of water to help my grandmother with an ankle injury that she was also dealing with. So before we listen to the next slide of her describing her visit to Auschwitz, I'm going to read one more quote from her article here. After more humiliating searches, we were to board the cattle cars. There were about 40. My father was the first aboard, and on seeing that it was full of animal litter, he grabbed a broom and started sweeping. He was joined by the 23-year-old sister of my best friend, who was a widow already. Her husband was killed in Russia while in forced labor camp. My father looked at her pensively and said, "Suzuka, take care of my little girl." The date was June 27th, 1944, my birthday. So we can go to the next slide.
The train crossed the Polish border, and at the end of 3 days, I turned 20 on the cattle car. And at the end of 3 days or so, we arrived somewhere at dawn. And we looked out and we saw lights, you know, and we were on there for several hours. Finally, they opened the doors and they told us to get down. And I looked across and I saw a group of men who were being beaten by sticks, you know, around their heads and shoulders. And I said to my dad, "Please, Dad, let me kiss you goodbye now." And I didn't want to see him beaten. And I said, "I will see you later." And he disappeared, you know, across. And my mother and I followed the women's line.
So that was the last time she's, oh, go back one just a second. So that was the last time she saw her father, and soon she would face one of the many lines that she would be separated by her mother. All right, you can play that one.
German guard, some officer or something, and without a word, you know, he pointed my mother to the left and me to the right. Well, you know, I had no idea what's on the left or what's on the right, but I didn't want my mother to go somewhere where I couldn't go with her. I didn't want her to be alone. So I said very quickly, and I spoke good German, I said, "Please, I want to go with my mother. I'm only 13 years old." Without even knowing that 13 and 14 was the age where they certainly went there with their mothers. But he shook his head. Well, he didn't even shake his head, just pointed at me.
So she would cry when she would tell me this story. You can see her eyes watering just then. She never stopped grieving, obviously. Her mother showed her so much love about family and cooking. And in a moment she was gone. And so that heavy grief is something she carried with her. These were hard stories to hear as a child throughout my childhood. So to be honest, because I heard them from her, I opted out of a lot of Holocaust education that was going on in my school. So I still haven't seen Schindler's List. I read Night much years later when we actually met Elie Wiesel. So I think instead we chose to comfort her through these memories whenever we could. But they would often come up. So if we go to the next slide, we'll take a look at the famous photos from the Auschwitz album. So these are Hungarian Jews. A German photographer was hired by the Germans to take these photos. So many people have been identified. My grandmother could have potentially been in any one of these lines and photographs as well. We now have more documents. As of even last last week. Thanks to our Legacy Speakers Bureau and our group, I actually have paperwork similar to this one that have been saved in the archives of her entry into Auschwitz. And so I don't know that I ever knew her number until now, that it's on these documents that have newly been scanned throughout different research organizations. So I'm thankful for that. So if we go on to the next slide, this is specifically Auschwitz and the gate that says in German, work makes one free, or work sets one free. 1.1 million prisoners were murdered at Auschwitz. 960,000 were Jews. My grandma was in Auschwitz for months in 1944 before they moved her to Allendorf, a slave labor camp. And so I have other of those. Her Buchenwald transfer document that has her name and her number. And we'll add those to the presentation as we continue to grow it. So before we go on to the next slide, she's going to describe one of the many selection lines. And this is another one of those stories that she did describe to us as we were growing up. So if we want to hear her share that.
And he said to me, "You won't do, you're too thin. Go that way," which was left. And I didn't go all the way there. I was watching Susie and her sister, what was going to happen. And he let them go, you know, to the line where it was a good line. And then I came back and he said to me, "I already told you, you're too thin, you won't do. Get out, get out." And I said, "Oh, but I spoke German very well. I said, "But I am very strong," which was kind of ridiculous to say. I said, "I'm very strong and I can work, go." And then a German woman was standing next to him. She was a guard. To me, you know, to everybody, she looked like a goddess because she had beautiful hair. Oh, all our hair was gone. You know, they shaved our heads and our whole bodies. And she was there, and she leaned to him, and she said, "Lass decline again." And he did. He did. And I joined that group.
So that's one of the many selection lines of Dr. Mengel throughout her time in Auschwitz. They stood naked with their shoes in their hands. And the more in-depth part of this story is that both Veras were sent to the other line, and Susie, Vera Shipash's older sister, or Suzuka, screamed, don't take my sister." And Dr. Mengel actually thought they were twins, and then after some inspection decided they weren't, and all three of them were able to be transferred to Allendorf. So the next slide will show that. So this is a photo of a similar line, a similar group of women that would have been her journey. So Vera and her friends were transferred from Auschwitz to Allendorf, and as I've seen here, it looks like we have this new document, or this document from the past of her going to Allenstein. It's amazing to actually have these documents now that have been scanned. So even though it was a good line, she was still a prisoner for the Nazis. They were transferred to the subcamps in Buchenwald. So the next slide is of Allendorf specifically. So these are photos of those imprisoned. This is a roll call line, most of which we know were killed. She worked in the kitchens and later in a munitions factory. She was there until December 1944. when they left the camp in a forced death march. Next, she's going to describe another story that she spoke of often, of her being able to work in the kitchens. She spoke of this often, and just something to think about is anyone who lived through this experience of why food and nutrition are so important to these survivors. So if we could listen to her now.
Susie says, wait, you wait right here, girls, and I'm going to go and see if we can go work in the kitchen. And we said, please don't go, don't leave us now, please, just stay right here. This is a crazy thought. Don't worry, just stay. So she left, and about half an hour, maybe 20 minutes later, she comes back and she says, well, we're going to be Kartoffelschälerins, potato peelers.
So they were part of the potato peeler squad, which I'll share more about in just a minute. They would chop cabbages. She actually spoke about in one of her interviews about how because they had enough food or potato peels in the kitchen, she would give her soup away almost daily to another woman so she would keep her strength up. Some of these women in the potato peeler squad would actually work the night shift for some other women because they were considered they had a good job, so they gave up their sleep to do a night shift for other prisoners. She said that she felt that she owed it to those women to take their places. It just shows so much about her character. And now she'll tell us about transferring to the munitions factory after gaining some weight back.
Definitely, I was thrown out of the kitchen. A German Auxiliary came in and said, "Du starke Junge, heraus," which means you strong youth, out. So I went in the, it was a munitions factory.
So her job at the munitions factory was splitting cable. That's one of the jobs that she did there. They were taking copper out of big, large cable that they would get out of the ocean. And then they would also take yellow powder, gunpowder off of the shipments of trucks that would come in and unload explosives from trucks that were being put into mines. She tells one story about working in the munitions factory, another that just shows her character. One of the guards was saying, was leaving, walking out the door for a moment, and he left another Jewish prisoner in charge, another Jewish female prisoner in charge, and said, you know, make sure everyone stays working. And as soon as the guard left, my grandmother put her chisel and hammer down and crossed her arms and said, "Oh, I'm not working, I don't have to work now." And the other Jewish prisoner said, "Get back to work." And she said, "No, we don't have to." And at that point, she was told on. The prisoner did end up shouting and yelling and telling on them. And so it just shows that she stood up to that. While she was working in the munitions factory, she talked about seeing Allied bombers, and that they stood out in full view, that they watched the Nazis scurry around the camp, but also that they thought that this would last for many years. They didn't see any future other than staying there. And they had no idea of the status of the war because that wasn't being communicated to them while they were there. So the next slide shows this death march. So this is one of many. So there was time in Allendorf, and then there was a death march, wooden shoes, They were all in their wooden shoes and their prison dresses. They went through the night, little towns in German. They were German towns. They were forced to walk away from the Allied troops that were coming in to save people from the slave labor camps. There were 1,000 of them, and they split up into many different small groups. So she split up into a group of about 15. And they did spend the night in the woods, and before finding some shelter with a family. So we can hear the next slide. Hear her explain liberation.
So the woman has a baby and standing by the window, and she starts muttering, "Ah, die amerikanische Panzerspitze, the American tank corps." And we run to the window, and by God, there are the Americans. So we ran out, and he's happy to see us. He has seen more of us. And he says, "I would like to give you something to eat, but I really only have a few," I don't know what it was. And he threw a few things out. I never caught anything. I was a bad catch. And there we were in this village. It was called Sondheim.
So they also stayed at a schoolhouse, a vacant schoolhouse, and then an American troops arranged for them to actually stay in a vacated Nazi general house, where they stayed for a few months in Sondheim as well. So the next slide is a photo taken in Sondheim after liberation. So this is a few months after liberation. And this is the potato peeler squad. That's my grandmother there. That's at the arrow there. And then the person just to the left of her is Vera Sheepush, her best friend. So I'm going to read an excerpt that the Holocaust Center shared with me recently about a book it's an excerpt from a book that's being written. A Holocaust story from another survivor. During our first 10 days at Buchenwald, something interesting occurred. A fellow prisoner made an unforgettable gesture of humanity. A girl from our barrack unexpectedly discovered a bucket of cooked potato skins behind the building where the food was being prepared. She excitedly carried the bucket to our room, careful to hide it from the guards. We couldn't believe we had found such a treasure. After finishing our unexpected feast and returning the bucket, we decided that we should check it again the next day. During each of our 10 days of rest, the bucket miraculously appeared, occasionally with bits of potato remaining on the skins. The extra nutrition helped strengthen our bodies, and even more importantly, the gift of potato skins strengthened our spirits. We would have loved to thank whoever was helping us, but we knew it wasn't possible. It's hard to believe, but decades later, by sheer coincidence, I met Vera Frank Federman, the woman responsible for the incredible gift of the potato skins. Vera and I became acquainted sitting beside each other at a wedding reception in Seattle. When Vera heard my accent, she explained she was a Hungarian and asked where I was born. She eventually mentioned that she had been in Auschwitz in a Buchenwald sub-camp near Allendorf. When Vera mentioned she had worked in the kitchen and I told her about my potato skins, finding the potato skins, she smiled broadly and said, "Oh, I know all about the potato peelings. I was the one leaving them. The first time I put them there, I saw a starving woman pick up a bucket. A few days later, I made sure the skins had a bit of potato on them. Those of us in the kitchen had food, but we could see that a lot of you were starving. I knew the Nazis would punish me if they found out, but it was worth the risk." I assured Vera that her courage not only gave us physical energy, but also refreshed our spirits. Our husband, sitting beside us at the buffet luncheon, smiled to see us excitedly conversing in Hungarian. As we were talking, Vera and I finished our first plate of food and then went to fill a second and then a third. We ate and ate and ate, with our husbands watching in astonishment. We then did our best to help them understand just how ravenous we suddenly felt recalling our time with the Nazis. So Vera and her friends were liberated in 1945 by American troops. After receiving documentation, they were allowed to return to Debrecen. So the next slide shows that journey home. And she actually made several trips back and forth from Budapest to Debrecen. Some of her belongings were found and most were not. So if we click one more time, we'll see the arrow, the journey there. Her and her friends knew that actually America was the home they wanted to be in. Budapest and Debrecen didn't have that feeling for them anymore. So the next slide is a photo of, this was saved by some non-Jewish friends that were saving some photos and other belongings. And her father is there in the back right corner. The arrow is pointing my grandmother Vera, and then her mother is just behind her. Most of the people in this photograph did not survive. And then if we go to the next slide, so the fate of the Hungarian Jews. So these are some of those astonishing numbers that we see. 825,000 Jews lived in Hungary, and 500,000 were killed, murdered, or gassed. So fewer than 1/3 of those Hungarian survived the Holocaust, and my grandmother was one of them. So after liberation, Vera settled into a displaced persons camp in Austria. She was hired by a joint distribution committee because she spoke English. This is a story she loved to tell as well, of working in this office place. And then she and her cousin Marika immigrated to the US after receiving a scholarship to the Hillel Foundation here in Washington. So next she'll describe that committee job.
This gentleman comes and he says, who can speak English? Can somebody speak English? So I raised my hand. I speak English. He said, "Oh, good, you're hired already." So I was working in the Landhaus, a very fancy place where General, I don't know, Mark Clark's office was, and since I spoke English very well, I could do the correspondence, and pretty soon they transferred me to immigration.
So because she spoke English, she was able to raise her hand highly and say, yes, give me that job. Next, she'll talk about her receiving a scholarship.
We got papers from the Hillel Foundation in Chicago saying that we should find 100 young people who had high school diplomas, and they can find them places at different universities. Well, we couldn't find anything like 100, because if you were a Polish Jew, you never graduated. So we found some Hungarians, and we were transferred to Stuttgart. And for Stuttgart, I found out that I was admitted to the University of Washington.
So I believe she took education. She took classes at the University of Washington throughout my childhood and throughout her adult life as well. I believe education was just so important to her. So the next slide, we'll see what that journey was like to get all the way to here. So I like showing this to students so they can see how long this journey was from Bremerhaven to New York. And then the next slide shows some photos of the journey to the United States. And I just found this last night, actually. This is from the US, I'm sorry, I know that it's not perfect to see it in this kind of way, but this is a list of other people that were attending and aborting the same, the SS Marine Tiger. So her name being on that list. And then that's her application for a US visa. And so the next, she will actually describe that journey on the next slide.
Took that was the SS Marine Tiger from Bremerhaven, and we arrived to New York in about 14 days. It was the worst winter in early 1948. We couldn't even see the Statue of Liberty, but my happy life began.
And she did. She treated it as a happy life. The next slide is, it looks like she's about 21 in that photograph. And then there's some other documents there of her coming here. Her and her cousin, Marika, went to University of Washington and were in sorority. And she had a letter of affidavit of support to be able to receive the citizenship and the scholarship. And the next slide is just photos of here in Seattle. So that's her wedding picture on the right, her and my grandfather Marvin. And then her son Marie's on top, and her daughter, my mother, is in the middle. It's one of my favorite pictures of my mother with her horse Princess that they both loved so much. And then she's there with her in-laws, the Federmans, in that bottom photograph. The next slide is some silly photographs of us together. So up in the upper left-hand corner, this is her fun experience, maybe first selfie photos with us, and then our last Mother's Day together, and then these bottom picture is her 90th birthday, and then her reading to my daughter there in the middle. The picture of us in the Nutcracker, my sister's there, and then my oldest daughter's in the bottom there. Many, many other fun memories and silly photos we could share. The next slide is actually of my daughter sharing her great-grandmother's, a little bit of her story, and during a legacy kind of historical family presentation last year in 2nd grade. So she learned 5 Hungarian words in order to share that story. And then the last slide here is one of my favorite pictures that I have framed here in my house. And the garden was her happy place. She lived a long, happy, healthy life. She was vivacious. Nutrition was top of mind. She did aerobics into her 70s, twice a week at the JCC. And those are things she passed along to us. I really wish I had taken better notes on her garden skills, because mine are not the same. But I do love to cook, and I wish I would have written down more of her recipes and more of her life notes. So that's my grandmother. Was very, very happy to share with you all today. I think we have some questions, so if there's anything in the Q&A, is that something that I should click on maybe? Q&A. Was your grandmother across the years able to feel forgiveness towards her captors in Germany? That's a really, really good question. I think that it's a question, students ask me that question too, if she had hostility towards the Germans at all. I think personally, she had a very hard time talking about that time. I think it was an all over pain for her. So forgiveness is a hard word. I think that she didn't want to forget, and she wanted to make sure that she honored the lives. I think she was still, and as many survivors I've heard, still very confused how it could even get that far. So she just had so much grief around it. So she wasn't angry and hateful at all. In fact, it was the opposite. She thought she wanted to embrace life to its fullest, to be able to honor the gift of being a survivor. What did Vera study at the University of Washington? Everything, everything she wanted to study, and she would constantly talk about it. Oh my gosh, philosophy, geography, poetry, writing, language. She's such a good writer. Let's see, your grandmother shared her story. Oh, thank you, I appreciate that. Did Vera have strong religious standing when she lived in the US? We celebrated some Jewish holidays. When we were kind of at their house, we do Passover and that sort of thing, but nothing was very like forced. Everything was very, very comfortable, and we would do some Hanukkah things together as a family. So let's see, was your mother involved in your grandmother's story? That's a question that comes up often as well. My answer to that is, I believe that my mother heard it even more than we did as grandchildren. And I think that she let my grandmother tell the stories. And so at this point, it's not something we talk about often, and I think that that's okay. I think that my grandmother and I both being survivors of something so traumatic, I think we shared that. And I wish I would have taken notes with her. Wish I would have gone to some of her presentations, and I wish I would have sat down with her and taken notes. Had I known I was going to be taking this this role on for her. So let me see. Thank you for sharing. My family lived next door to Vera, Marvin, and Judy. Oh, thank you. That's very sweet. A neighbor is writing in, so I'm so glad you were able to hear the story. Yeah, she loved her neighbors on Mercer Island. That's wonderful. Let's see, another question over here. Why did Hungary readily collaborate with the Nazis and allowed Jewish citizens to be deported? Ooh, that's a historical question, and I wish I knew more of all of those history things and pieces of why people did things. I'm a student of the Holocaust, a lifelong student of the Holocaust, but I've now been researching now more than ever to find those kind of answers, and I think it was different for everybody. I think some were just saving their own lives and their own families. So, oh, this is great. Thank you. Someone says thank you for sharing and seeing the photos of Vera in her younger life. Oh, thank you. Yeah, we're really lucky to just continue to gain more and more knowledge, and these documents to be able to be scanned. I can look forward to incorporating them into the presentation. Let's see, what else do you see in your daughter? Oh, that is like Vera. Okay, my daughters read so much. My youngest is in 3rd grade. She'd read a chapter book at night. We love going to her bookstore. So I'm going to do a plug for the Mercer Island bookstore, because that's my favorite bookstore. They still have the little playhouse. We were just there before it was shut down. I try and go there every couple of months at least. They're now doing online orders, so even though they can't be open, you can still order books from them. So let's keep them alive and keep them going. That was her favorite bookstore, and mine too as a child. So We love reading. We love going to the theater. We love plays. So that's something I would have loved to keep continuing to do with my daughters and her together. Do you think your grandmother believed in God? Oh, good question. Yes, but nothing. It wasn't any sort of religious force in that way for me. So I think she believed. It's a really good question, and I really wish I would have asked her more specifically on that. I think she believed in goodness and that we will all be okay. And so that's how I answer that when students ask me that question as well. Many survivors are reluctant to talk about their experiences. Very true. My grandmother chose not to be silent. I don't know that she ever was. I think that she always spoke about it, and maybe she chose to speak for the people who remained quiet. And I think that that's okay. I think that that's great. I know many cancer survivors that choose not to speak about their story. So I take it as a responsibility, and I think my grandmother did too. That if you're going to be a voice, just be that voice. And so she did not want anyone to forget. She lost her parents very quickly, and most everyone else in her family, and she felt a responsibility to share it. What were her and your favorite books on the Holocaust? She probably had many, and like I said, I actually opted out of reading many. The Tattoo Artist of Auschwitz I just read last year, and I love that book. I thought it was so beautifully written. I just finished The Cage, which was also beautiful, different story. Every story is completely different. Let's see, one more question here. Such fun memories. Oh, yes. Oh, thank you, Susan. That's very sweet. Let's see, any other questions? I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining and for all your wonderful questions and engagement and joining us today and listening to my grandmother's story. I know there's another Lunch and Learn next Tuesday, same time, same everything for the Jewish Home service. So thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of the week, and take care, be safe. Thank you. Bye.